The rope burned through Hannah Sullivan's wrists like liquid fire. Each jolt sent lightning up her arms as her body scraped across the hard-pan earth, her boots digging desperate furrows in the dust. The horse ahead thundered on relentlessly, its hooves kicking up clouds of grit that filled her mouth and nose with the taste of iron and defeat. Her dress, the one she'd sewn herself from good blue cotton, shredded against the rocks. The fabric that had taken 3 evenings by lamplight to hem now hung in ribbons from her shoulders. Blood seeped through the tears, warm and sticky against her skin. She could feel every pebble, every thorn, every cruel edge of the unforgiving ground as it tore at her flesh. The worst part wasn't the pain, it was the laughter behind her. Riding easy on their mounts, 3 men followed at a comfortable pace. Their voices carried over the thunder of hooves, and her own ragged breathing, casual, amused, like they were watching a dog chase a stick. "Reckon she's learned her lesson yet, Xavier?" One called out, his voice thick with whiskey and satisfaction. "Not likely," came the reply from the man holding the other end of the rope, Xavier Brennan. His voice was steady, almost detached. "Stubborn as her mama was, but we got time." Hannah's world narrowed to the rhythm of impact and recovery, hit the ground, bound scramble for footing that never came. The rope would go taut, yanking her forward again before she could catch her breath. Her bare feet, she'd lost both shoes in the first 100 yards, were cut to ribbons. Each step left a small smear of red in the dust. With a burst of desperate energy, Hannah reached down toward her right boot where she had hidden a small knife. Her fingers brushed against the leather, feeling for the secret compartment she'd sewn in herself. The horse ahead quickened its pace, and she slammed hard against a jutting rock. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs, but her fingers closed around the knife's handle. The men behind her were in no hurry. This wasn't about getting somewhere. This was about making a point, about teaching the whole county what happened to women who said no to the wrong man, about making sure every other girl who might get ideas about choosing her own path would remember Hannah Sullivan and think twice. With trembling fingers, she began sawing at the rope binding her wrists. The blade was small, meant for cutting twine or opening letters, not slicing through braided hemp. Still, it was something. It was hope. The rope jerked again, and this time she couldn't roll with it. Her body hit the ground hard, shoulder first, and for a moment her vision went white. The knife flew from her grasp, landing in the dust several feet away, glinting once in the merciless sun, before disappearing beneath a cloud of dust kicked up by the horse's hooves. When her vision cleared, she could taste blood. Had she bitten her tongue? The inside of her cheek. Everything hurt too much to tell anymore. Above her, a hawk circled, lazy and patient, waiting. She wondered if it could smell death coming the way buzzards were said to. She wondered if her bones would bleach here in this forsaken stretch of nowhere, another warning for other women who forgot their place. The horse slowed to a walk, and for a blessed moment, the dragging stopped. Hannah lay gasping in the dust, trying to work feeling back into her torn hands. The rope had cut deep. She could see white bone gleaming through the blood at her left wrist. The sight of it made her stomach turn, but she didn't look away. She'd earned those wounds. "You ready to be reasonable yet?" Xavier called down from his saddle. His voice was conversational, almost friendly, like they were discussing the weather over Sunday dinner. Hannah turned her head and spat blood into the dirt. "Go to hell." The laughter came again, harder this time. "Hear that boy's still got some fight in her." "Won't last long in this heat," said another voice she recognized now as Timothy Lane, one of Xavier's regular drinking companions. "Maybe we should find some shade," let her think it over. "No shade out here," Xavier replied. "But that's all right. Pierce don't need a pretty bride, just a live one." The words hit her like a physical blow, not because they were cruel. She'd heard cruel words before, but because they were true. Victor Pierce didn't care if she came to him broken and bloody. He'd paid good money for her, and her father's gambling debts made her a commodity to be collected, not a person to be courted. The third man spoke up. She didn't know his name, but she'd seen him around Pierce's estate, a hired gun with cold eyes and quick hands. "Boss is getting impatient. He wants this settled before Sunday." 3 days. She had 3 days before they dragged her to a preacher and forced her to speak vows that would make her suffering legal. 3 days before Victor Pierce would own her completely, body and soul, until death did them part. The horse started moving again. This time Hannah didn't try to get her feet under her. She let herself be dragged, saving her strength, feeling the world blur past in a haze of pain and dust and blazing sun. Her dress was gone now, except for tatters around her waist. The rope had rubbed her wrists raw and then bloody and then down to bone. But inside her chest, that fire her mother had always talked about still burned. They could drag her across every mile of desert between here and Mexico. They could break her bones and tear her flesh and leave her bleeding in the dirt, but they couldn't make her say yes. They couldn't make her willing. As the rope pulled taut again, jerking her forward into another stretch of hell, something fluttered down from Xavier Brennan's pocket, a folded piece of paper that landed just inches from her face. In the split second before she was dragged past it, Hannah caught sight of handwriting she would recognize anywhere. Her mother's handwriting. The shock of it gave her strength she didn't know she had. When the horse paused again at a small rise, she lunged for the paper fingers closing around it just as the rope yanked her forward once more. She clutched it tight against her palm, hiding it from view as she was dragged onward. Behind her, the men rode on patient as death, certain as sunrise. They had time, and they had rope, and they had a woman who'd forgotten her place. What they didn't have was any idea that 20 miles ahead, a different kind of man was riding their way. A man who'd heard the sound of suffering on the wind and was already reaching for his rifle. But Hannah didn't know that yet. All she knew was pain and rope and the endless stretch of desert that might well become her grave. The sun climbed higher and the dragging continued, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried once before disappearing into the white-hot sky. 3 months earlier, Hannah Sullivan had stood in the dusty main street of Copper Ridge, Arizona territory, watching her father stumble out of McGillicuddy's saloon with blood on his knuckles and shame in his eyes. She'd known then that something had shifted in their world, something that would change everything. But she hadn't known how deep the rot had already spread. Thomas Sullivan had been a good man once, a man who'd built their ranch from nothing but sweat and determination, who taught his daughter to read from the same Bible he'd carried through the war. But the desert had a way of grinding down even good men, and the cards at McGillicuddy's had a way of taking what little hope they had left. Hannah had grown up knowing she was different from the other girls in Copper Ridge. While they learned needlework and proper conversation, she'd been out with her father mending fences and breaking horses. While they practiced piano in parlors that smelled of rosewater and propriety, she'd been reading law books by lamplight, dreaming of a world bigger than this sun-scorched valley where women were valued by the acre and sold by the head of cattle. Her mother, God rest her soul, had encouraged those dreams. Elizabeth Sullivan had been a school teacher before marriage, a woman who'd come west with books in her trunk and poetry in her heart. She taught Hannah that a woman's mind was every bit as sharp as a man's and twice as dangerous when properly honed. But Elizabeth had died when Hannah was 20, taken by a fever that no amount of prayer or medicine could break. That's when everything started to crumble. Without Elizabeth's steady hand, Thomas Sullivan had begun to drift. First, it was just a drink after the hardest days, then a game of cards to pass the evening hours. The ranch work suffered fences, went unmended. Cattle wandered off and weren't pursued, and slowly, steadily, the debts began to pile up like tumbleweeds against a fence. Hannah had tried to hold things together. She'd ridden the property lines herself, fixed what she could, sold what they didn't need. But she was one woman trying to do the work of 3 men, and the creditors were patient as vultures, circling closer with each passing month. The first time Victor Pierce had come calling, she'd thought it was about business. He owned the largest spread in the territory, controlled the water rights for 30 miles in any direction, and had politicians in Phoenix who jumped when he whistled. A man like that didn't court women, he acquired them, like he acquired land through careful negotiation and overwhelming leverage. Pierce was 58 years old, thick around the middle, with hands that stayed soft because other men did his hard work. His first wife had died in childbirth 10 years back, taking their baby with her. His second wife had lasted 3 years before she'd been found at the bottom of Devil's Canyon with a broken neck and a belly full of laudanum. The sheriff had called it an accident, but then again, the sheriff owed Pierce money too. When Pierce had first suggested marriage, Hannah had thought he was making some kind of elaborate joke. She was 23, educated, and had plans that stretched far beyond the boundaries of Arizona territory. She was going to sell the ranch, use the money to go east, maybe become a teacher like her mother, or study law like she'd always dreamed. Marriage to a man like Pierce wasn't even a possibility she'd considered. But Pierce hadn't been joking. He laid out his proposition with the same calm precision he used to discuss cattle prices. Her father owed him $8,000 money borrowed against the ranch to cover gambling debts and back taxes. The debt was due in full by year's end, and Thomas Sullivan didn't have $800, let alone $8,000. I'm prepared to forgive the debt entirely, Pierce had said, sitting in their modest parlor like he owned it, which Hannah realized with growing horror he essentially did. In exchange for your daughter's hand in marriage. Hannah had actually laughed out loud, thinking this had to be some kind of territorial joke she'd never heard before. But when she'd looked at her father's face, the way he wouldn't meet her eyes, the way his hands shook as he reached for his coffee cup, she'd realized this was no joke at all. "That's not how marriage works, Mr. Pierce," she'd said, keeping her voice level despite the rage building in her chest. "I'm not property to be traded." Pierce had smiled, and it was the most frightening expression she'd ever seen on a human face. "Miss Sullivan, everything in this territory is property to be traded. The only question is price." Her father had finally found his voice. "Hannah, you need to consider—" "I need to consider nothing," she'd snapped, rising from her chair with such force that her teacup rattled against its saucer. "Mr. Pierce, I appreciate your generous offer, but my answer is no." That had been the first refusal. Clean, simple, direct. Pierce had left without argument, tipping his hat like a perfect gentleman. But his eyes had held a promise that made Hannah's skin crawl. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The night after Pierce's visit, Hannah couldn't sleep. She walked out to the small cemetery on the hill behind their house, where her mother was buried beneath a simple wooden cross. The desert night was cool and clear, the Milky Way stretching across the sky like spilled cream. Hannah knelt by the grave, placing a worn law book on the small mound. It was one of her mother's treasures, a copy of Blackstone's commentaries that Elizabeth had carried all the way from Boston. "I don't know what to do, Mama," Hannah whispered, her voice barely audible above the night wind. "He wants to buy me like cattle, and Papa seems ready to sell." She traced her fingers over the carved letters of her mother's name, worn smooth by 3 years of desert winds. "You always said I had too much fire for this place," Hannah continued, "that someday I'd burn too bright for them to bear. But what if that fire gets me killed? What if it's not enough?" Above her, a hawk circled in the moonlight, its silhouette cutting across the stars, free and wild and untethered by the concerns of men. Hannah watched it until it disappeared beyond the ridge, its cry echoing across the empty desert. "I promise you this," she said, finally rising to her feet. "I won't let him own me. I won't forget what you taught me, not even if it kills me." She touched the cross one last time, then turned and walked back down the hill, the worn law book clutched to her chest like a shield. The second time Pierce came calling, he'd brought reinforcements. Pastor Mackenzie from the Baptist church, looking uncomfortable but determined. Judge Morrison from the territorial court, sweating in his black robes despite the evening cool. And Xavier Brennan, Pierce's foreman, standing silent and threatening by the door. Hannah noticed something odd about Brennan that night. The way he looked at her, not with the usual contempt or lust she'd grown accustomed to from men in town, but with something like recognition. Like he was seeing someone else when he looked at her face. "Miss Sullivan," Pastor Mackenzie had begun, his voice gentle but firm, "your father has asked me to speak with you about your reluctance to accept Mr. Pierce's proposal." Hannah had looked at her father, then really looked at him. He'd aged 10 years in the 2 weeks since Pierce's first visit. His hands shook constantly now, and she could smell whiskey on his breath, even though it was barely past noon. The weight of his debts and the consequences of her refusal were crushing him. "A woman's duty," Judge Morrison had intoned, "is to obey her father in matters of marriage. The law is quite clear on this point." "The law," Hannah had replied, "recognizes that women have the right to refuse a proposal. Last I checked, we weren't still living in the Old Testament, Pastor Mackenzie." The pastor had winced. "Hannah, I've known you since you were baptized. Your mother was a fine woman, a godly woman, but perhaps she filled your head with ideas that aren't practical for a woman in your situation." The fury that had filled her then was white-hot and pure. They were using her mother's memory as a weapon against her, twisting Elizabeth Sullivan's dreams for her daughter into something shameful and wrong. "My mother," Hannah had said, her voice deadly quiet, "taught me that I was worth more than cattle and acreage. She taught me that my mind and my choices belonged to me, not to any man who happened to hold my father's debts." Pierce had spoken for the first time that evening. "Your mother is dead, Miss Sullivan. and the dead don't pay debts. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Pastor Mackenzie had looked shocked at the bluntness of it. But Pierce hadn't finished. Your father owes me $8,000. If that debt isn't settled by Christmas, I'll foreclose on this ranch and everything on it. Your father will go to debtor's prison in Phoenix, and you'll be thrown off this land with nothing but the clothes on your back. In January, when the snows come to the high country, you'll freeze or starve or both. He'd paused, letting the words sink in like poison. Or he'd continued, you can marry me. The debt disappears. Your father keeps his freedom, and you become one of the wealthiest women in the territory. It's not a difficult choice, Miss Sullivan, unless you value your pride more than your father's life. Hannah had felt the trap closing around her like a steel jaw. Pierce hadn't just bought her father's debt. He'd bought the power to destroy both their lives, and he was willing to use that power without hesitation. But still, she'd said no. The second refusal. Harder than the first, but just as firm. As Pierce and his entourage were leaving, Xavier Brennan had lingered behind for a moment. When the others were out of earshot, he'd turned to Hannah with an expression she couldn't read. You look just like her, you know, he'd said, his voice low and rough. Same fire in the eyes. Before she could ask what he meant, he was gone, leaving Hannah with a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The third time had been different. No genteel visits or polite conversation. They'd come at dawn when the desert was still cool, and Hannah was in the barn milking their 2 remaining cows. She'd heard the horses before she'd seen them, but by then it was too late to run. Xavier Brennan had kicked in the barn door like he was raiding a bandit camp. Behind him came Timothy Lane and the cold-eyed stranger with the well-used gun belt. They'd found her crouched behind the milk cow, clutching the bucket like it might somehow protect her. Time's up, Miss Sullivan, Xavier had said, his voice oddly gentle. Mr. Pierce is tired of waiting. She tried to run then, but there was nowhere to go. The barn had only one door, and they'd blocked it. When she'd scrambled up into the loft, they'd simply waited below like hunters who'd treat a fox. Come down easy and nobody gets hurt, the stranger had called. Make this hard and your daddy might have an accident. That's when she'd remembered the old Sharps rifle her father kept hidden in the hay, a relic from his army days. Heavy and awkward, but still functional. She'd found it by feel, loaded it with shaking hands, and pointed it down at the 3 men who'd come to steal her life. Get out, she'd said, trying to keep her voice steady. Get off our land. Xavier had actually laughed. Girl, you even know how to use that thing. She'd pulled the trigger. The rifle had kicked like a mule, nearly knocking her backward into the hay. The bullet had gone wide, punching a hole through the barn wall 6 feet from Xavier's head. But the message had been clear enough. For a moment, the men had stood frozen, clearly not expecting armed resistance. Then the stranger had drawn his pistol with snake-quick speed, and Hannah had known she was about to die. But Xavier had held up a hand, stopping his companion mid-draw. Easy, Colt. No need for killing. Not yet. He'd looked up at Hannah with something like respect in his eyes. That was your 3rd no, Miss Sullivan. And your last. They'd burned her out, set fire to the hay in the loft while she was still in it, forcing her to jump down into their waiting hands. By the time her father had come running from the house, they'd already tied her hands and thrown her across a saddle like a sack of grain. Thomas Sullivan had tried to stop them. Hannah would give him that much. But he was one broken-down rancher against 3 armed men, and the outcome had never been in doubt. They'd left him unconscious in the dirt beside their burning barn with a message for Pierce. The wedding would be Sunday morning, whether the bride was willing or not. Now, as the rope jerked her forward across another stretch of desert hardpan, Hannah understood the full scope of Pierce's trap. He hadn't just bought her father's debt. He'd bought the sheriff, the judge, the preacher, and half the town council. He'd turned the law itself into a weapon pointed at her heart. But what Pierce didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that some things couldn't be bought or sold or owned. Some fires burned too hot to be smothered by money or threats or ropes. The horse ahead of her stumbled slightly, and Xavier cursed as he fought to keep his seat. For just a moment, the rope went slack, and Hannah managed to drag herself upright. Her body screamed in protest, every muscle torn and bruised from the dragging. But she forced herself to look ahead. The desert stretched endlessly onward, heat shimmers dancing above the alkali flats like spirits of the dead. Somewhere out there was Mexico, or California, or any of a dozen places where Victor Pierce's money couldn't reach if she could just survive long enough to get there. Behind her, Timothy Lane spat into the dust. "Stubborn bitch is going to die before she gives in." "Won't matter," Xavier replied. "Dead or alive, Pierce gets what he paid for." The rope went taut again, and Hannah was dragged forward into another mile of hell. But now she understood the true weight of what she was fighting against, not just three men with horses and guns, but an entire system designed to break women like her. A world where marriage was just another word for ownership, and love was a luxury that poor women couldn't afford. They could drag her across every inch of Arizona territory. They could beat her and burn her and leave her bleeding in the dust. But they couldn't make her accept a world where women were nothing more than property to be traded. The fire her mother had lit in her heart still burned, and it would keep burning until the day she died. With bloodied fingers, Hannah carefully unfolded the paper she'd snatched from the dust. It was fragile with age, the creases worn thin from frequent handling. She shielded it from the men's view with her body as the horse dragged her forward in fits and starts. It was a letter or part of one. The paper had been torn, leaving only a fragment, but the handwriting was unmistakable, the same elegant script that had filled the margins of her law books with notes and encouragement. "Must be careful now. P suspects something. If anything happens, look for the tin box in the barn wall behind the loose stone. Everything I've gathered is there. Remember what I told you about a woman's true strength. Xavier says he'll help, but I don't know if I can trust him completely. There's something in his eyes when he looks at me. Something I recognize. Love you always." Elizabeth Hannah's heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't a love letter as she'd first feared. It was something else entirely. Something that suggested her mother's death might not have been the simple tragedy everyone believed. The letter was addressed to someone other than her father. Someone her mother had trusted. Someone who might have known the truth about Elizabeth Sullivan's final days. And somehow Xavier Brennan had ended up with it. The gunshot cracked across the desert like thunder from a cloudless sky. The rope went slack so suddenly that Hannah's body tumbled forward into the dust, momentum carrying her several yards before she could force her torn hands to grip the earth and stop her slide. For a heartbeat, silence hung over the wasteland. No hoofbeats, no laughter, no cruel voices calling out commands. Just the whisper of wind through sagebrush and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Then chaos erupted. "What the hell?" Xavier Brennan's voice cut off abruptly as another shot rang out, this one close enough that Hannah could hear the bullet whistle past. His horse reared, nearly throwing him from the saddle, and she heard him curse as he fought to control the animal. "Shoot her on the ridge!" Timothy Lane shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "They're behind the rocks!" Hannah forced herself to roll over, squinting through blood-matted hair and dust-caked eyelashes. The rope that had bound her to Xavier's horse hung loose, now its end frayed where a bullet had severed the braided leather clean through. Her wrists were still tied, but she was no longer tethered to the horse that had been dragging her toward death. The three men had scattered, seeking whatever cover they could find in the sparse landscape. Xavier had dismounted and crouched behind his horse rifle in hand, scanning the rocky outcroppings to the east. Timothy had wheeled his mount in a tight circle, clearly wanting to run, but afraid to expose his back to whoever was shooting. The third man, the cold-eyed stranger they call Colt, had simply vanished, melting into the landscape like smoke. Another shot echoed across the desert, and this time Hannah saw the muzzle flash from a cluster of red sandstone boulders about 200 yards away. Someone was up there, in those rocks. Someone with a rifle and the skill to use it. Someone who had cut her free with a single perfectly placed shot. "Show yourself," Xavier bellowed, his voice carrying across the flats. "This ain't your business, stranger." The response came not as words, but as another bullet, this one close enough to Xavier's head that his hat flew off and tumbled across the hardpan. He dove behind a larger rock, dragging his horse with him. "Like hell it ain't my business," a voice called, back deep and steady, carrying the kind of authority that came from men who'd learned to command in places where commands meant the difference between life and death. "Turn around and ride back where you came from, and nobody else has to bleed today." Hannah tried to push herself upright, but her body refused to cooperate. The hours of being dragged had taken their toll. Her dress was nothing but rags, her skin raw and bleeding from a dozen different wounds, and every muscle felt like it had been beaten with hammers. But she was alive, and for the first time since they'd burned her out of the barn, she felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. "You don't know what you're interfering with, mister," Timothy called out, his voice shrill with fear and anger. "This woman's bound for marriage, legal marriage sanctioned by the church and the territorial government." A harsh laugh echoed from the rocks. "Funny kind of marriage that requires ropes and dragging. Where I come from, we call that kidnapping." Xavier rose slightly from behind his cover rifle aimed toward the ridge. The woman's father signed the papers. Debt settlement, all legal and proper. She belongs to Victor Pierce now, whether she likes it or not. "Well now," the voice replied, and Hannah could hear dark amusement in it. "I reckon I'll let the lady speak for herself on that matter." The stranger called out to her, then his voice gentler, but still carrying across the desert with perfect clarity. "Ma'am, can you hear me up there?" Hannah tried to answer, but only a croak came out. Her throat was raw from dust, and screaming, her lips cracked and bleeding. She managed to raise one bound hand and wave weakly. "That's good," the voice continued. "Now I need you to listen carefully. Do you want to marry Victor Pierce?" This time she found her voice broken but audible. "No." "Misha, do you want these men to take you to him?" "No, harm." Stronger this time, the anger giving power to her words. "Do you want me to kill all three of these sons of bitches where they stand?" Hannah felt a savage smile cross her torn lips. "Yes." Xavier Brennan rose from behind his cover rifle leveled. "Enough of this. You got no right." The rifle shot from the ridge cut him off mid-sentence. The bullet struck his weapon, spinning it from his hands and sending him diving back behind the rocks. Hannah heard him cry out in pain, not a mortal wound, but enough to remind him that the stranger in the rocks could have killed him just as easily. "I got every right that matters," the voice called back. "And I got enough ammunition to settle this argument permanent-like. Your choice, boys. Ride away or stay here and feed the buzzards." Timothy Lane looked around wildly, clearly wanting to flee, but afraid to move. His brother was clutching his right hand, blood seeping between his fingers where flying metal had torn the skin. And Colt was still nowhere to be seen, which made Hannah's skin crawl. Men like him didn't disappear unless they were planning something deadly. The standoff stretched for long minutes, tension crackling in the desert air like heat lightning. Hannah lay in the dust, trying to work some feeling back into her bound hands and listening to the sound of her own breathing and the distant murmur of wind through stone. Whoever was up in those rocks had bought her time, maybe even bought her life. But she wasn't safe yet. Not while Colt was still out there, somewhere circling like a wolf. Then she heard it, the soft scrape of boot leather against stone coming from behind and to her left. Colt had worked his way around through the rocks, using the standoff as cover to get into position. In another minute, maybe two, he'd have a clear shot at their mysterious rescuer. Hannah tried to shout a warning, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. She tried to move, to make some noise that would alert the man in the rocks, but her body was too broken, too exhausted. All she could do was watch helplessly as Colt crept closer to his target. That's when she saw the knife. It had fallen from Xavier's belt when he dove for cover, a heavy-bladed skinning knife in a leather sheath. It lay in the dust about 10 feet away, glinting in the harsh sunlight. 10 feet might as well have been 10 miles given her condition. But it was her only chance. Hannah began to crawl. Every inch was agony. Her torn knees left bloody smears in the dirt. Her bound hands made balance nearly impossible, and her battered ribs screamed with each movement. But she kept moving, dragging herself forward with pure stubborn will, focused entirely on that knife blade catching the sun. Behind her, she could hear Xavier calling out to the ridge, "You're making a big mistake, stranger. Victor Pierce owns half this territory. He's got men, money, and politicians in his pocket. You kill us, and he'll hunt you to the ends of the earth." "Let him try," came the calm reply. "I've been hunted by better men than Pierce, and I'm still here." Hannah reached the knife and managed to work it free from its sheath with her bound hands. The blade was sharp, well-maintained, and heavy enough to do real damage. She turned it around and began sawing at the ropes around her wrists, ignoring the way the steel bit into her torn flesh. Movement in the rocks caught her eye. Colt was almost in position now, crouched behind a boulder, with his rifle trained on the ridge where their rescuer was hidden. In seconds, he'd have a clear shot. The ropes parted with a soft snap, and Hannah felt blood rush back into her hands like liquid fire. She gripped the knife properly and forced herself to her feet, swaying but upright. Her legs felt like water, but they held her weight. Colt raised his rifle. Hannah threw the knife. She'd learned to throw blades when she was 12 years old, target practice with her father using old fence posts and tree stumps. She wasn't as good as she'd once been. Her hands were torn and shaking, her depth perceptions skewed by exhaustion and pain. But she was close enough and angry enough and desperate enough. The knife took Colt in the right shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle clattering across the rocks. He screamed a sound of pure rage and pain that echoed across the desert. The sound of his voice gave away his position, and immediately 2 more shots rang out from the ridge bullets, striking the stone where he'd been hiding. But Colt was already moving, rolling away from the rocks, with the knife still protruding from his shoulder. He came up with a pistol in his left hand, firing wildly toward the ridge, while using his momentum to reach better cover. The distraction was enough. Xavier and Timothy both broke from their hiding places, running for their horses with panic overriding caution. Xavier made it to his mount and hauled himself into the saddle one-handed, his injured right hand useless. Timothy was right behind him, both men spurring their animals into a desperate gallop away from the killing ground. But Colt wasn't running. Even wounded, even outgunned, he was still thinking like a predator. Hannah saw him working his way through the rock toward her, using the landscape for cover. He'd lost his rifle, but he still had his pistol, and he was close enough now that he wouldn't need to be particularly accurate. She looked around desperately for another weapon, another hiding place, anything that might help her survive the next few minutes. But there was nothing, just open desert and scattered stones. Nowhere to run and nothing to fight with. That's when the stranger appeared. He came down from the ridge like an avalanche, moving with fluid grace across terrain that would have challenged a mountain goat. Hannah caught only glimpses of him as he descended, a tall man in a dark coat, rifle in one hand, moving with the kind of deadly purpose that made her blood run cold. He reached the desert floor just as Colt emerged from the rocks, and for a moment the 2 men faced each other across 30 yards of empty ground. Colt fired first, but his injured shoulder threw off his aim. The bullet went wide, striking stone and whining away into the distance. The stranger didn't hurry his shot. He brought his rifle up smooth and steady, took careful aim and squeezed the trigger. The bullet caught Colt's center mass, lifting him off his feet and dropping him onto his back in the dust. He twitched once, twice, then lay still, blood pooling beneath him, dark and spreading in the harsh sunlight. Silence fell over the desert again, broken only by the distant sound of hoofbeats as Xavier and Timothy fled toward the horizon. Hannah stood swaying in the heat, watching the stranger as he approached Colt's body and kicked the pistol away from the dead man's hand. Then he turned toward her, and she got her first good look at the man who had saved her life. He was older than she'd expected, maybe 45, with silver threading through dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of too much sun and too many hard decisions. His face was weathered like old leather, scarred in places, but his eyes were kind. Not soft, there was nothing soft about this man, but kind in the way that deep water was kind, patient and steady and vast. He wore practical clothes, dark pants, a cotton shirt, a leather vest that had seen better years. His gun belt was worn but well-maintained, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who'd faced death so many times it had become just another part of his daily routine. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was the same one that had called out from the ridge, deep, steady, carrying the hint of an accent she couldn't quite place. "Name's Robert Morgan. Friends call me Falcon. Are you hurt bad?" Hannah tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come. Now that the immediate danger had passed, her body was remembering all the damage it had sustained. Her legs gave out, and she would have fallen if Falcon hadn't moved fast enough to catch her. His arms were strong and steady, and for the first time in days, Hannah felt safe. Not rescued, not yet, but safe enough to let herself acknowledge just how close she'd come to dying in this God-forsaken stretch of desert. "Easy now," Falcon murmured, supporting her weight like she was made of spun glass. "You're safe. They're gone and they won't be coming back. Not today." Hannah looked up into his weathered face and managed to whisper, "Thank you." Falcon Morgan smiled, and it transformed his entire face. "Don't thank me yet, ma'am. We still got to get you somewhere safe, and that's going to be the hard part." As consciousness slipped away from her, Hannah felt the stranger lift her carefully into his arms. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was the hawk still circling overhead free and wild against the endless blue sky. Falcon Morgan's camp was hidden in a box canyon 5 miles north of where he'd found her, sheltered by towering red walls that blocked the wind and provided blessed shade from the merciless sun. A small spring bubbled up from between the rocks, creating a pool of clear water that seemed like a miracle after the endless alkali dust of the open desert. Hannah Sullivan sat on a flat boulder beside the spring, letting the cool water run over her torn feet while Falcon tended to her wounds with the methodical care of a man who'd patched up plenty of people in his time. His hands were gentle but sure as he cleaned the rope burns on her wrists, applied salve to the worst of the cuts, and wrapped everything in clean white bandages from his saddlebags. "You're lucky," he said, securing the last of the bandages. "Nothing's infected yet, and I don't think anything's broken. You'll heal given time and rest." Hannah flexed her fingers experimentally. The pain was still there, but duller now. Manageable. "Lucky," she repeated, and there was bitter humor in her voice. "Is that what you call it?" Falcon settled back on his heels, studying her face in the golden light of late afternoon. "You're alive when you shouldn't be, Ryan. That's lucky in my book." She looked around the hidden canyon, taking in the neatly organized camp, the hobbled horses grazing on sparse grass near the spring, the careful way everything was arranged for quick departure if needed. "You've been living out here for a while." "Few months," Falcon confirmed. He moved to the small fire he'd built in a ring of stones and started working on something that smelled like coffee and bacon. "Sometimes it's safer to avoid towns." "What did you do?" Hannah asked, watching him closely. Falcon glanced back at her, one eyebrow raised. "Ma'am, to make it safer to avoid towns. What did you do?" For a long moment, Falcon was quiet, poking at the fire with a stick. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "I killed 3 men in Tucson. Good men, mostly. Men who didn't deserve killing." Hannah felt her stomach tighten. "Why, boy?" "Because they were going to hang an innocent man, and I couldn't let that happen." Falcon's jaw worked as if the words tasted bitter. "Turned out I was wrong. The man they were hanging wasn't innocent after all. He'd killed a family, mother, father, 2 children, burned their house down around them while they slept." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the gentle sound of water over stone. Hannah tried to process what he'd told her. This man who'd saved her life, who'd risked himself for a complete stranger, was wanted for murder. "The law's been hunting me ever since," Falcon continued. "Can't say I blame them. I interfered with justice, got good men killed, let a monster walk free for another 3 weeks before they caught him again. Every town I ride through, I check the wanted posters to see if my face is looking back at me. But you still stopped to help me." Falcon looked at her, then really looked at her, and she saw something deep and complicated in his eyes. "Maybe I was trying to balance the scales. Maybe I just got tired of riding past suffering and pretending it wasn't my business." Hannah studied his weathered face, trying to read the man behind it. There was pain there and regret and a bone-deep weariness that spoke of too many mistakes and too many miles. But there was also strength, and underneath everything else, a core of decency that no amount of guilt could erode. "What's your plan now?" she asked. "For you get you somewhere safe, maybe California or Oregon territory. Somewhere Pierce's money can't reach." "And for you," Falcon shrugged, "keep riding, keep my head down. Try not to make any more mistakes that get people killed." Hannah stood up, testing her weight on her bandaged feet. They hurt, but they held her. She walked to the edge of the spring and knelt down, cupping the clear water in her hands and drinking deeply. It was the first clean water she'd tasted in days, and it seemed to wash away some of the dust and fear that had been choking her. When she looked back at Falcon, he was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I can't go to California," she said. The sun was setting behind the canyon walls, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. In the distance, she could hear coyotes starting their evening song. But Hannah wasn't thinking about the beauty of the desert or the peaceful sounds of the evening. She was thinking about Sunday morning and the look on Victor Pierce's face when she walked into that church, very much alive and very much unwilling to say the words he'd paid for. It was going to be a hell of a wedding. Night fell over the canyon like a velvet curtain, stars appearing one by one until the sky was ablaze with their cold, distant light. Hannah sat beside the fire, wrapped in a blanket. Falcon had given her the torn paper from Xavier's pocket spread carefully on a flat stone between them. "This is your mother's handwriting?" Falcon asked, studying the fragment. Hannah nodded. "Elizabeth Sullivan. She died 3 years ago. Fever, they said." "And you think maybe it wasn't—" "I don't know what to think." Hannah stared into the flames, watching them dance and flicker. "But Xavier Brennan had this letter in his pocket. A letter my mother wrote to someone about being careful because P suspects something. About a tin box hidden in our barn wall with evidence she'd gathered." "Evidence of what, and why would Xavier have it?" Falcon was silent for a long moment, his face unreadable in the firelight. "Your mother, what was she like?" The question caught Hannah off guard. She'd expected him to focus on the letter, on the mystery it presented, not on Elizabeth Sullivan herself. "She was different," Hannah said slowly, searching for the right words. "Not like other women in Copper Ridge. She'd been educated back East Boston, came west to teach Met. My father fell in love, but she never quite fit in. The other women in town thought she was too outspoken, too independent. She taught me to read from law books instead of the Bible, told me I could be anything I wanted to be." "And what did you want to be?" "A lawyer." Hannah smiled faintly at the memory. "I was going to go east, study law, come back and make sure women like us had someone to stand up for them in court. Mama always said the law wasn't just for men with money, that it was supposed to protect everyone if only someone would make it do its job." Falcon nodded, something like approval flickering across his features. "Smart woman." "The smartest I've ever known." Hannah's smile faded. "And then she got sick. Just a fever, they said. But it took her so fast, 3 days from the first symptoms to the end." She swallowed hard, pushing back the grief that still rose in her throat whenever she thought about those terrible days. Her mother burning with fever, delirious, trying to tell her something important, even as the life drained out of her. And her father already drinking more than he should, useless in the face of tragedy. "After she died, everything fell apart," Hannah continued. "Papa started drinking heavily, gambling away what little money we had. The ranch went to ruin, and then Pierce showed up with his offer." Falcon's face hardened at the mention of Pierce's name. "Victor Pierce is a cancer on this territory. He's been buying up ranches, water rights, whole towns for the past 15 years. Men who stand against him tend to have accidents. Women who catch his eye tend to end up as his property one way or another." There was something in his voice, not just general disgust, but personal hatred, like he knew Pierce beyond reputation. "You've dealt with him before," Hannah said. It wasn't a question. Falcon's eyes met hers across the fire, and for a moment she saw something flicker there, a decision being made. "I knew his second wife," he said finally. "Catherine. She wasn't from around here, came from San Francisco, daughter of a shipping magnate. Educated, beautiful, full of life. Pierce courted her for 6 months, showered her with gifts, promised her the world. By the time they married, she thought she was getting a wealthy, cultured husband and a life of luxury in the Arizona territory." He paused, poking at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward into the night sky. "What she got was a prison. Pierce kept her isolated at his ranch, cut off from friends and family. When she tried to leave, he beat her. When she threatened to tell her father, he broke her arm. When she finally managed to smuggle out a letter asking for help, it found its way to a federal marshal's office in Tucson. My office." Hannah's breath caught in her throat. "You were a marshal." Falcon nodded grimly. "For 12 years, I was assigned to investigate Catherine's claims. But by the time I got to Copper Ridge, she was already dead. Fell from Devil's Canyon, they said. An accident while riding. The local sheriff in Pierce's pocket, of course, had already ruled on it. Case closed." "But you didn't believe it." "I knew it was a lie the moment I saw the body." Falcon's voice was flat, controlled, but Hannah could hear the anger underneath. "The bruises on her neck weren't from a fall. She was strangled, first then thrown over to make it look like an accident. But I couldn't prove it. The local doctor had already signed the death certificate. The sheriff refused to reopen the case. And every witness I tried to interview suddenly couldn't remember seeing anything." Hannah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "And you think my mother might have been looking into Catherine's death?" "I think it's possible." Falcon met her eyes across the fire. "Your mother sounds like the kind of woman who would notice things, ask questions. The kind who wouldn't be satisfied with convenient explanations for inconvenient deaths." And if Pierce found out she was investigating him, Hannah couldn't finish the thought. The implications were too horrible to voice. It would explain the fever that killed her so quickly, Falcon said quietly. There are poisons that mimic the symptoms of certain diseases. Hard to detect unless you know what you're looking for. And I doubt the doctor who attended your mother was looking very hard. Hannah stared into the fire, feeling as though the ground was shifting beneath her. Everything she thought she knew about her mother's death, about the past 3 years of her life, was suddenly in question. We need to find that tin box, she said finally. If Mama was collecting evidence against Pierce, if she hid it in the barn wall like the letter says. The barn that Xavier and his friends burned down, Falcon reminded her gently. Hannah's heart sank. She'd forgotten that detail in the rush of new information. Then it's gone. Everything she gathered, everything she was trying to prove, it's all ash now. Maybe, maybe not. Falcon leaned forward, his face serious in the firelight. Stone doesn't burn. If the box was truly hidden in the wall itself, there's a chance it survived. We'd have to go back to your ranch to know for sure. We'd have to get past Pierce's men, Hannah said. They'll be watching the place, especially after what happened today. Falcon smiled, and there was something wolfish about it. I've gotten past worse. For the first time since her rescue, Hannah felt a flicker of hope. If her mother had been murdered, and if Pierce was responsible, then finding that evidence might be the only way to bring him to justice, to ensure that Elizabeth Sullivan hadn't died in vain. But first, Falcon said, rising to his feet, we need to check on your father. If Pierce knows you've escaped, Thomas Sullivan will be his first leverage point. The thought of her father sent a fresh wave of worry through Hannah. Despite his failings, despite his willingness to sell her to Pierce to cover his debts, he was still her father, still the man who had taught her to ride to shoot, to love the harsh beauty of the desert. We'll start at first light, Falcon decided. Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. As Hannah settled onto the bedroll he'd prepared for her, she found herself watching Falcon across the dying fire. There was more to his story than he was telling her, she was sure of it. Something personal in his hatred for Pierce, something beyond professional outrage at a murder he couldn't prove. But whatever secrets he was keeping, he'd saved her life. He was offering to help her find the truth about her mother's death. For now, that would have to be enough. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in days, Hannah Sullivan slept without fear. The dream came, as it always did, fragments of memory pieced together by her sleeping mind. Her mother sitting at the kitchen table late at night, writing furiously by lamplight, hiding the pages when Hannah entered the room. Elizabeth Sullivan riding back from town with a strange expression on her face, part fear, part determination. A man's voice hushed in urgent speaking with her mother in the barn, while Hannah listened from the shadows. He'll kill you if he finds out, Elizabeth. You have to be more careful. Her mother's reply steady and unflinching. Some truths are worth dying for, Robert. Robert. The name echoed in Hannah's mind as she drifted toward wakefulness. Robert. Falcon. Robert Falcon Morgan. Her eyes flew open, the last vestiges of sleep vanishing as realization dawned. She sat up, looking across the now cold ashes of the fire to where Falcon slept, his back against a boulder, rifle across his knees, even in slumber. He had known her mother, known her well enough to be on a first-name basis to warn her about the dangers of whatever investigation she was conducting. And he had lied to Hannah about it, or at least hidden the truth. The question was why. As if sensing her scrutiny, Falcon's eyes opened, instantly alert. His gaze found hers across the camp, and something in her expression must have given away her thoughts. You knew her. Hannah said, her voice flat in the pre-dawn stillness. You knew my mother. For a long moment, Falcon didn't respond. Then he sighed a sound of resignation. Yes, he said simply. I knew Elizabeth. And you didn't think that was worth mentioning when I showed you her letter last night, when I told you she might have been murdered. I was trying to figure out how much you already knew. Falcon rose to his feet, stretching muscles stiff from a night spent sitting against stone. How much your mother had told you before she died. She told me nothing, Hannah said, anger rising in her chest. She died delirious with fever, trying to tell me something I couldn't understand. And now I find out you knew her, knew she was in danger, and you're only telling me because I remembered her saying your name in a dream. Falcon had the grace to look ashamed. I should have told you right away. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't answer my questions. Hannah stood as well, wincing as her battered feet protested the movement. How did you know my mother? What was she investigating? And why are you really helping me? Is it just guilt because you couldn't save her? The last question struck home. She could see it in the way Falcon flinched in the pain that flashed across his weathered features. It's complicated, he said finally. Then uncomplicate it. Falcon ran a hand through his silver-streaked hair, a gesture of frustration. I met your mother after Catherine Pierce's death. I was in Copper Ridge, asking questions no one wanted to answer, getting nowhere. Elizabeth approached me in town one day, slipped me a note saying she had information. We met in secret. She knew Pierce had eyes everywhere. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. She told me she'd been friends with Catherine, that Catherine had confided in her about Pierce's abuse, said she had suspicions about the accident, but no proof. I told her what I suspected, that Pierce had murdered his wife, but explained that without evidence, there was nothing I could do officially. And she decided to find that evidence herself, Hannah said, beginning to understand. Falcon nodded. She was remarkable, brave in a way few people are. She started gathering information, financial records showing Pierce's bribes to local officials, testimonies from servants at the Pierce estate who'd witnessed his violence patterns of land acquisitions that always seemed to follow the deaths of the owners. And you let her do this, knowing how dangerous Pierce was? I tried to stop her, Falcon said, a hint of defensiveness in his tone. Told her it was too risky, that she should let me handle it through official channels. But she was determined. Said Pierce had hurt too many people, taken too much from the territory. Said someone had to stand up to him. The description matched everything Hannah knew about her mother, her fierce sense of justice, her unwillingness to look away from wrongdoing. We worked together for nearly 6 months, Falcon continued, meeting in secret, piecing together the evidence. We were close, so close to building a case that even Pierce's bought judges couldn't ignore. And then she got sick, Hannah finished for him. Falcon's face darkened. It wasn't an illness, Hannah. It was poison. I'm sure of it. The symptoms matched arsenic poisoning perfectly. I'd seen it before in other cases. But by the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. The local doctor had already declared it a fever, and your father wouldn't allow an autopsy. Papa wouldn't. Hannah felt the blood drain from her face. Why would he refuse? Falcon hesitated, clearly weighing how much to tell her. Your father knew about your mother's investigation, he said finally. Not all of it, but enough. He thought she was being foolish, risking too much. They argued about it constantly in those last months. When she died, I think he was relieved in a way. Relieved that it was over, that Pierce's attention wouldn't fall on him or you. The revelation struck Hannah like a physical blow. Her father had known, had chosen his own safety and hers to be fair over justice for her mother's murder. And now he's selling me to Pierce, she said, the bitter irony of it washing over her. To the man who killed my mother. I don't think Thomas knows Pierce was behind Elizabeth's death, Falcon said. I think he believes it was a natural illness, and he's just trying to save himself from debtor's prison the only way he can. By trading his daughter. Hannah's voice was cold, like cattle. I'm not defending him, Falcon said, just trying to understand his choices. Hannah turned away, staring out at the dawn light beginning to illuminate the canyon walls. Everything she thought she knew about her life was shifting, rearranging itself into a darker pattern. You still haven't answered my last question, she said without turning around. Why are you helping me now? Why come back after 3 years? She heard Falcon sigh behind her. I never left, not really, he admitted. After Elizabeth died, after I lost my badge over the Tucson incident, I kept watching Pierce from a distance, kept gathering evidence, hoping to find enough to bring him down. When I heard he was planning to marry you, I knew I had to intervene. Because I'm Elizabeth's daughter. Yes, the simplicity of his answer made her turn to face him again. I owed her that much. I failed to protect her. I wasn't going to fail her daughter, too. There was something more in his expression, something he wasn't saying, a depth of feeling that went beyond professional obligation or even friendship. You loved her, Hannah said, the realization dawning slowly. You were in love with my mother. Falcon didn't answer directly, but his silence was confirmation enough. Did she love you back? Hannah asked, not sure she wanted to know the answer. She loved your father, Falcon said carefully. Whatever was between us, it was complicated by our work together, by the dangers we faced. We never had a chance to find out what it might have been. Hannah nodded, slowly processing this new understanding of her mother's life. It didn't change who Elizabeth had been, a woman of principle, a seeker of justice. But it added dimensions to her that Hannah had never considered, painted her as more human, more complex than the sainted figure of her memories. "We should get moving," Falcon said, clearly eager to change the subject. "If we're going to check on your father, we need to do it before Pierce's men have a chance to regroup." Hannah nodded, pushing aside her tangled emotions for now. Whatever had happened between her mother and this man, whatever secrets they had shared, the immediate concern was her father's safety and finding the evidence Elizabeth had hidden. As they saddled the horses and prepared to leave the sanctuary of the canyon, Hannah found herself watching Falcon with new eyes. Not just as her rescuer, but as a man who had known and loved her mother. A man who might be the key to understanding Elizabeth Sullivan's final days and avenging her death. They approached the Pierce compound from the south, using a ridge of low hills for cover. Falcon had insisted they scout the situation before deciding on their next move, and Hannah had to admit the caution was warranted. If Pierce had indeed taken her father hostage, charging in blindly would only get them all killed. The compound was impressive, a sprawling adobe hacienda surrounded by outbuildings, corrals, and bunkhouses for the ranch hands. A small army of men moved about the property, many of them openly carrying rifles. This wasn't just a ranch, it was a fortress. Hannah and Falcon lay belly down on the ridge, using a spyglass to study the scene below. The midday sun beat down on their backs, but neither moved. Patience was the hunter's virtue, Falcon had reminded her, and right now they were hunting information. "There," Hannah whispered, pointing toward a small outbuilding near the main house. "That's my father." Thomas Sullivan sat on a bench outside what appeared to be a tool shed, a bottle of whiskey in his hand. He looked disheveled but unharmed, drinking steadily as he stared at nothing in particular. More surprisingly, he wasn't bound or guarded. He was simply sitting there like a man waiting for something unpleasant to be over. "He's not a prisoner," Hannah said, confusion and anger warring in her voice. "He's just there, drinking." Falcon adjusted the spyglass, studying the scene carefully. "Maybe not a prisoner in the traditional sense, but he's not free to leave. Look at the men watching him from the bunkhouse porch. They're making sure he stays put." Hannah looked again and saw he was right. Two of Pierce's men were indeed keeping an eye on her father, though they were being casual about it. "Still, he doesn't look like he's being mistreated," she said. "He looks like he's made himself at home." Before Falcon could respond, the door to the main house opened, and Victor Pierce himself emerged. Hannah had only met him twice before, but she would know that stocky figure anywhere. The expensive clothes, the carefully trimmed beard, the way he moved like a man accustomed to owning everything he surveyed. Pierce walked directly to where Thomas Sullivan sat drinking and said something that made her father look up. Hannah couldn't hear the exchange, but she could see her father nod, then rise unsteadily to his feet. The two men walked together toward the main house, Pierce's hand on Thomas's shoulder in what looked almost like a friendly gesture. "They look like old friends," Hannah said, the words bitter in her mouth. "Or business partners," Falcon added grimly. "I think your father might be more complicit in this arrangement than we realized." The implication hung heavy in the air between them. Not just that Thomas Sullivan had agreed to sell his daughter to cover his debts, but that he might have done so willingly, eagerly even. "We need to get closer," Hannah decided. "I need to hear what they're saying, see what's really happening." Falcon shook his head. "Too risky. There are at least 20 armed men down there. Even if we could get close enough to eavesdrop, we'd never get out again if we were spotted." "Then what do we do?" Hannah demanded. "Just sit here and watch while my father and Pierce plan my wedding." "We stick to the original plan," Falcon said firmly. "We go to your ranch, search for the evidence your mother hid. If we find it, we might have leverage against Pierce, something to force his hand." Hannah wanted to argue, wanted to insist on confronting her father directly. But she knew Falcon was right. Without evidence, without leverage, they were just two people against Pierce's small army. "Fine," she said reluctantly. "But if that tin box isn't there, if it burned with the barn, then we come back here. I won't leave my father with Pierce, no matter how willingly he went." Falcon nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Fair enough. Let's get moving before someone spots us up here." They retreated carefully, keeping the ridge between themselves and the compound until they were well out of sight. Only then did they mount their horses and begin the ride toward the Sullivan Ranch. Neither spoke much during the journey. Hannah was lost in thoughts of her father, the broken man she'd seen drinking outside Pierce's house, so different from the strong, principled rancher who had raised her. Had Pierce threatened him, bribed him, or had Thomas Sullivan simply given up, decided that selling his daughter was easier than fighting for what was right? And beneath those thoughts ran a deeper current of unease. If her mother had been murdered for investigating Pierce, if the evidence she'd gathered was still hidden somewhere on their property, then returning to the ranch might be walking straight into danger. But she had to know the truth, had to find what her mother had died to protect. As they crested the final rise overlooking the Sullivan Ranch, Hannah felt her heart catch in her throat. The barn was indeed gone, nothing left but a blackened skeleton of charred beams and ash. The house still stood, but it looked abandoned, forlorn in the late afternoon light. "Home," she said softly, the word carrying a weight of irony. Falcon scanned the property carefully before nodding. "Looks clear. No horses, no movement. But we should still be careful. Pierce might have left someone to watch the place." They approached cautiously, circling wide to come in from behind the house rather than down the main drive. Falcon insisted on checking the house first, moving through the rooms with his pistol drawn while Hannah waited outside. "All clear," he called finally. "But they've been through the place, searching for something." Hannah entered her childhood home and felt a wave of anger wash over her. The furniture had been overturned, drawers emptied onto the floor, even the floorboards in some places had been pried up. Pierce's men had torn the place apart, looking for the same evidence she and Falcon sought. They were thorough, Falcon observed, nudging a pile of her mother's books with the toe of his boot. But sloppy. They didn't know exactly what they were looking for. "The barn," Hannah said, already moving toward the door. "We need to check the barn." What remained of the structure was even more disheartening up close. The fire had been intense, reducing most of the wooden walls and stalls to ash. The stone foundation remained, along with parts of the back wall where the hayloft had been. "Mama said it was behind a loose stone," Hannah murmured, trying to remember the exact wording from the letter fragment. "In the barn wall." They began searching methodically, checking each remaining stone in the partial walls, looking for one that might be loose or different from the others. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the ruins, making their task more difficult with each passing minute. "It's not here." "Sure," Hannah said finally, frustration evident in her voice. "It either burned in the fire or Pierce's men already found it." "We don't know that," Falcon insisted. "We haven't checked everything yet." But his voice lacked conviction. The destruction was too complete, the remaining structure too fragmented to yield many hiding places. As darkness fell, they were forced to abandon their search. Hannah stood amid the ruins of the barn, feeling a despair that went beyond physical exhaustion. Without the evidence her mother had gathered, what chance did they have against a man like Pierce, a man with money, power, and dozens of armed men at his command? "We'll try again in the morning," Falcon said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "There's still the stone foundation to check, and parts of the wall we couldn't see properly in this light." Hannah nodded, but her heart wasn't in it. She felt the weight of her mother's death, her father's betrayal, and her own uncertain future pressing down on her like a physical burden. They made camp in the house, barricading the doors and windows as best they could in case Pierce's men returned. Falcon built a small fire in the kitchen hearth, careful to keep it low, so the light wouldn't be visible from a distance. As they sat in the flickering firelight eating a sparse meal of jerky and hardtack, Hannah found herself studying the man across from her. The man who had loved her mother, who had tried to protect her, and who had now risked his life to save Hannah herself. "Tell me about her," she said suddenly. "About working with her. What was she like when she was investigating, fighting for justice?" Falcon looked up, surprise evident in his eyes. Then his expression softened, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "She was fearless," he said. "Not reckless, but determined. Once she set her mind on something, there was no stopping her." "That sounds like Mama," Hannah agreed, her own smile tinged with sadness. "She had this way of talking to people, getting them to open up." Falcon continued, warming to the subject. "Servants at the Pierce estate who wouldn't say a word to me would tell her everything. She'd bring them small gifts, a ribbon for a little girl, tobacco for an old man, and just listen. Really listen. Hannah could picture it perfectly, her mother's gentle persistence, her genuine interest in others' lives. It was how she'd taught how she'd moved through the world. She was building a case not just against Pierce for Catherine's murder, but against his entire operation, Falcon explained. The bribes, the intimidation, the way he acquired land through threats and violence. She said he was at a cancer on the territory and she was determined to cut him out. Even knowing how dangerous he was, especially then. Falcon's expression grew serious. She said once that fear was how men like Pierce controlled people, that the moment you stopped being afraid, you started being free. The words resonated with something deep inside Hannah. Wasn't that what she'd felt when she'd refused Pierce's proposal? When she'd pointed her father's rifle at Xavier Brennan? When she'd thrown the knife at Colt despite her injuries, a freedom that came from refusing to be afraid even when fear was the rational response? She would have been proud of you, Falcon said quietly as if reading her thoughts. The way you fought back, the way you've refused to be broken. Hannah felt tears sting her eyes for the first time since her rescue. Not tears of fear or pain, but of loss. Of missing the remarkable woman who had shaped her, who had died fighting the same battle Hannah now found herself in. I wish, she began, then stopped unsure how to articulate the ache in her chest. I know him, Falcon said simply. And she believed he did know, that he carried his own regrets about Elizabeth Sullivan and what might have been. They sat in companionable silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts, the fire slowly dying to embers between them. Outside, the desert night was alive with sounds, the distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of wind through sagebrush, the occasional cry of a nightbird. Sounds that had once been the backdrop to Hannah's entire life, but which now seemed like echoes from another world. A world where her mother was alive, her father was whole, and her future was still bright with possibility. A world she might never see again. As she drifted towards sleep, wrapped in a blanket on the floor of what had once been her bedroom, Hannah found herself thinking of Sunday morning, of the church in Copper Ridge where Pierce expected to claim her as his bride, where he expected to finalize his ownership of her body and soul. If the tin box couldn't be found, if her mother's evidence was truly lost, then perhaps that church was still where this would end. Not with Hannah as Pierce's bride, but with a reckoning long overdue, with justice for Elizabeth Sullivan and freedom for her daughter. The thought followed her down into dreams where her mother's voice seemed to whisper from the darkness. Some truths are worth dying for, Hannah. But living for them, that's the real challenge. The rising sun cast long shadows across the ruins of the barn as Hannah and Falcon resumed their search. They worked methodically, checking every remaining stone in the foundation, probing the charred earth where walls had once stood. Hours passed with nothing to show for their efforts except dirt-stained hands and growing frustration. It has to be here, Hannah insisted, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. Mama wouldn't have mentioned it in the letter if it wasn't important. Falcon straightened, wincing, as his back protested the movement. Maybe we're thinking about this wrong. Your mother was smart. She wouldn't have hidden something so important in an obvious place. Hannah looked around the destroyed barn, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. None of this looks obvious to me. No, Falcon frowned, thinking, if I wanted to hide something in a barn somewhere, no one would think to look. Where would I put it? Hannah closed her eyes, trying to picture the barn as it had been before the fire. The stalls for the horses and milk cows, the hayloft above, the tack room in the corner where they'd kept saddles and bridles. Her eyes snapped open. The watering trough. What? The stone watering trough, Hannah said, excitement building in her voice. It was built into the foundation on the north side. Heavy stone never moved. Papa had it put in when I was little. They hurried to the north wall where portions of the foundation still stood. The fire had been less intense here, away from where the hay had been stored, and there, partially hidden by fallen debris, was a large stone trough built into the wall itself. Help me clear this, Hannah said, already pulling away charred beams and clumps of ash-covered straw. Together they exposed the trough, a solid basin carved from a single piece of sandstone. It looked undamaged by the fire, though empty of water and partially filled with debris. It's too solid, Falcon said, running his hands along the rim. There's no way to hide anything inside the stone itself. Not in the stone, Hannah corrected. Under it. She pointed to the base of the trough where it met the foundation wall. See how it's set? It's not part of the foundation, it's sitting on top of it. There could be space underneath. Falcon studied it with new appreciation. Smart, very smart. But how do we move it? This thing must weigh 300 pounds. Hannah was already looking around the ruins, her eyes landing on a length of charred but still solid beam. We need a lever. They worked together, positioning the beam beneath one end of the trough and using a smaller stone as a fulcrum. Falcon put his weight on the lever while Hannah knelt ready to look beneath the raised edge. Anything, Falcon grunted, straining against the beam. Not yet. A little higher. The trough lifted another inch and Hannah pressed her face close to the gap, peering into the darkness beneath. For a moment, she saw nothing. Then as her eyes adjusted, she made out a small cavity in the foundation, so it's a space where one stone had been carefully removed and replaced with a wooden panel painted to look like stone. There's something, she said, excitement making her voice tremble. A hidden compartment. Can you reach it? Hannah stretched her arm into the narrow gap, fingers scrabbling against the wooden panel. It was just beyond her reach. I need more space, she said. We have to lift it higher. Falcon adjusted his grip on the lever. On 3, 1, 2, 3, he threw his full weight against the beam and the trough lifted another precious inch. Hannah thrust her arm into the gap, feeling her sleeve tear against the rough stone. Her fingers touched the edge of the panel and she pushed, feeling it give slightly. It's a false front, she called to Falcon. There's a space behind it. With a final effort, she managed to hook her fingers around the edge of the panel and pull. It came away in her hand, revealing a dark cavity beyond. And there, nestled in the darkness, was a small tin box, the kind that might once have held tobacco or candy, now repurposed as a hiding place for secrets. I've got it, Hannah cried, pulling the box free. Just as Falcon's strength gave out, the trough slammed back down onto the foundation with a dull thud that sent dust and ash billowing into the air. Hannah sat back on her heels, the tin box clutched to her chest, hardly daring to believe they'd found it, that her mother's final secret was now in her hands. Falcon crouched beside her, his face etched with equal parts exhaustion and anticipation. Let's take it inside, he suggested. Safer there. They retreated to the house, securing the door behind them before setting the box on the kitchen table. It was smaller than Hannah had expected, no larger than a book, and surprisingly light. The tin was dented in places, tarnished with age, but the simple latch that held it closed was intact. Hannah hesitated, her hand hovering over the latch. Whatever was inside this box had been important enough for her mother to hide. Important enough, perhaps, for her to die for. Do you want me to open it? Falcon asked gently. She shook her head. No, this is between me and her now. With a deep breath, Hannah lifted the latch and opened the box. Inside, carefully arranged, were several items: a small leather-bound journal, a stack of letters tied with faded ribbon, what looked like financial documents folded into neat squares, and most surprising of all, a daguerreotype photograph in a small frame. Hannah lifted out the photograph, first holding it up to the light streaming through the kitchen window. It showed a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, her serious expression softened by the hint of a smile at the corners of her mouth. She was beautiful in a quiet way, with dark hair arranged in the style of at least 25 years ago, and eyes that seemed to look directly into Hannah's own. She was also unmistakably Hannah's mother, Elizabeth Sullivan, though much younger than Hannah had ever known her. But it was the baby in Elizabeth's arms that made Hannah's breath catch. A small bundle face barely visible, except for a tuft of dark hair. Is that you? Falcon asked, peering over her shoulder at the image. Hannah shook her head slowly. I don't think so. The date? She turned the frame over, finding an inscription on the back, Elizabeth and Xavier, 1860. Xavier, Falcon's voice sharpened. As in Xavier Brennan, the man who was dragging you behind his horse? Hannah felt the room spin around her as the implications settled into place. Xavier Brennan is my brother, my half-brother. Her hands trembling, she set down the photograph and reached for the journal, flipping it open to the first page. Her mother's familiar handwriting flowed across the paper, May 15th, 1860. My son was born today. I have named him Xavier after my grandfather. He is perfect and beautiful, and I love him more than I thought possible. But I cannot keep him. Father says I must give him up, that no respectable man will marry me with an illegitimate child. Tomorrow he will be taken to St. Mary's Orphanage in Tucson. I pray that someday he will understand and forgive me. Hannah flipped forward through the pages, reading fragments at random. October 3rd, 1862. Married Thomas Sullivan today. He is a good man, kind and hardworking. He knows nothing of Xavier, and I pray he never learns of my shame. We leave for Arizona Territory in a week to start our new life. June 18th, 1863. Hannah born today. My beautiful daughter. When I hold her, I cannot help but think of the son I gave up. Does he have Thomas's dark hair as Hannah does? Does he laugh as she laughs? April 4th, 1880. Saw a young man in town today who took my breath away. He has my father's eyes, my chin. It can only be Xavier. He is a man now working for the Pierce Ranch. I wanted to run to him to tell him everything, but what right do I have? I abandoned him. He would hate me, and rightly so. The entries continued detailing Elizabeth's secret observations of the son she had given up her anguish at seeing him grow into manhood without knowing who she was. And then intertwined with these personal confessions came darker observations. March 10th, 1882. Catherine Pierce found dead today. They say she fell from Devil's Canyon, but everyone knows Victor beats her. I saw the bruises myself last month when she came to the general store. No one will speak against him, of course. He owns half the county. April 15th, 1882. Met with Marshal Morgans again. He believes Catherine was murdered but can't prove it. I've told him I'll help. Someone must stand against Pierce before he destroys this entire territory. Hannah looked up at Falcon, who had been reading over her shoulder. You're in here, she said, her voice strained with emotion. Keep reading, he urged softly. The journal continued detailing Elizabeth's growing investigation into Pierce's activities, the bribes, the intimidation, the suspicious deaths that always seemed to benefit his business interests. And alongside this, a parallel narrative emerged. Elizabeth had revealed her identity to Xavier Brennan, told him she was his mother. July 8th, 1882. Xavier knows the truth now. I finally found the courage to tell him. His reaction was not what I had hoped. He is angry, bitter. He says I threw him away like garbage, that he grew up believing himself worthless, unwanted. I tried to explain, but my reasons sound hollow even to my own ears. He stormed off, said he never wanted to see me again. My heart is broken, but I deserve no less. But the story didn't end there. Subsequent entries showed Xavier returning, asking questions about his birth, about why she had given him up. A tentative relationship forming fragile as spun glass. August 20th, 1882. Xavier came to the barn again tonight. We talked for hours. He is still angry, but beneath that I sense a desperate need to understand, to belong. He has agreed to help with my investigation into Pierce. He works closely with him, sees things others don't. This is dangerous for him, but he insists. Perhaps this is his way of forging a connection between us, a shared purpose, if not a shared life. The final entries grew increasingly urgent, filled with details of financial transactions that implicated Pierce in land fraud, witness statements about Catherine's last days, and Elizabeth's growing fear that she was being watched. October 3rd, 1882. Pierce suspects something. One of his men followed me into town today, watched while I met with R. I need to be more careful. I've hidden all the evidence in the tin box. If anything happens to me, R knows where to find it. I pray it won't come to that. October 10th, 1882. Xavier warned me today that Pierce is asking questions about me, about my friendship with Catherine. He says I should leave, take Hannah and Thomas, and go east before it's too late. But I can't abandon the investigation now, not when we're so close to the truth. The final entry was dated October 15th, 1882, 3 days before Elizabeth Sullivan had fallen ill with the fever that would kill her. I believe Pierce knows what we're doing. Xavier says he's been acting strangely, asking about my movements, my friends. I've written to R, told him where to find the box if I'm unable to deliver it myself. I pray it won't come to that, but I'm not naive. Men like Pierce don't allow threats to their power to go unchallenged. If anything happens to me, I hope Hannah will someday understand. That she'll know I fought not just for justice, but for a world where she could live free from men like Pierce, where her worth wouldn't be measured by her utility to powerful men, but by the fire of her own spirit. I love you, my daughter. Be braver than I was. Be stronger. The journal ended there. Hannah closed it gently, tears streaming down her face. Her mother's voice seemed to echo from the pages, reaching across the years. with a message Hannah had been waiting to hear without realizing it. She knew, Hannah whispered. She knew Pierce might kill her, and she kept fighting anyway. She was the bravest person I've ever known, Falcon said quietly. And now you know why Xavier Brennan was so conflicted about you, why he looked at you the way he did. He saw her in me, Hannah realized. His mother, the woman who gave him up, then found him again, only to be taken from him forever. She set the journal aside and reached for the stack of documents. As she and Falcon examined them, the full extent of her mother's investigation became clear. Elizabeth had compiled evidence of at least 3 suspicious deaths tied to Pierce's business interests, including detailed witness accounts of Catherine Pierce's abuse in final days. There were records of bribes paid to Judge Morrison and Sheriff Caldwell, copies of land deeds obtained through coercion, and sworn statements from former employees about Pierce's violent temper and business practices. This is enough, Falcon said, his voice tight with suppressed excitement. Enough to bring him down even with his bought judges and sheriffs. If we can get this to the territorial governor in Phoenix. We'd never make it, Hannah interrupted. Pierce has men watching every road. And even if we did, who's to say the governor isn't in his pocket too? Then what do you suggest? Hannah looked down at the photograph of her mother holding baby Xavier, at the journal chronicling Elizabeth's courage and determination, at the evidence that had cost her life. We take it public, she said slowly, the plan forming as she spoke. We go to the church on Sunday just as Pierce expects, but instead of a wedding, we give them a trial. We present the evidence to the entire town, to the officials Pierce has bought, to everyone who's ever looked the other way while he built his empire on blood and fear. Falcon frowned. That's incredibly dangerous. Pierce will have armed men there. He'll try to stop you, silence you by any means necessary. I'm counting on it, Hannah said, a cold determination settling in her chest. Let him show his true nature in front of the whole town. Let them see what kind of man he really is. You could be killed. So could you. So was my mother. Hannah met his gaze unflinchingly. But some truths are worth dying for. Isn't that what she believed? Falcon held her eyes for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Yes, that's exactly what she believed. Then we do this her way. We finish what she started. As they began planning their approach, sorting through the evidence, and deciding how best to present it, a noise from outside the house froze them both. The unmistakable sound of approaching horses. Falcon moved to the window, peering carefully through a gap in the curtains. 3 riders, he reported, his voice tense. Coming up the main drive, and one of them is Xavier Brennan. Hannah felt her heart stutter in her chest. Her brother. The man who had dragged her through the desert, who had known their mother, who had both helped and betrayed Elizabeth Sullivan's quest for justice. Are they armed? She asked, already knowing the answer. Of course. Falcon was moving quickly now, gathering the evidence and returning it to the tin box. We need to go, now, out the back before they surround the house. But Hannah stood rooted to the spot, the photograph of Elizabeth and baby Xavier still clutched in her hand. A strange certainty was forming in her mind, a certainty that running was not the answer. Not this time. No, she said. I'm staying. Falcon turned to her, disbelief written across his weathered features. Have you lost your mind? Those men tried to kill you yesterday. Not Xavier, Hannah corrected. He had multiple chances to kill me, but he never did. He wanted to frighten me, to break me, but not to kill me. Hannah, he's my brother, she interrupted. My blood, and he loved our mother in his way. I need to talk to him. While his friends put bullets in both of us, not a chance. Falcon was shoving the tin box into his saddlebag, preparing to flee. Then you go, Hannah said. Take the evidence, get it to safety. I'll delay them, talk to Xavier. Make him understand what we're trying to do. I'm not leaving you here to die. I won't die, Hannah said with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. Xavier won't let them kill me, not once he knows I know the truth. Falcon stared at her, clearly torn between the need to protect the evidence and his promise to keep her safe. Outside, the horses were getting closer. They were running out of time. Go out the back, Hannah urged. Circle around to stay hidden. If I'm wrong, if they try to harm me, then you can intervene. But give me a chance to reach him first. For a moment, she thought Falcon would refuse. Then with a muttered curse, he slung the saddlebag over his shoulder. 10 minutes, he said. If you're not both walking out of here calmly in 10 minutes, I'm coming in shooting. Fair enough. With a final look that combined frustration, admiration, and fear in equal measure, Falcon slipped out the back door, disappearing into the scrub brush beyond the house. Hannah took a deep breath, steadying herself. Then she tucked the photograph into her pocket, smoothed her hair as best she could, and walked to the front door. She stepped onto the porch just as Xavier Brennan and his two companions reined in their horses in the yard. The look of shock on Xavier's face would have been comical under different circumstances. He clearly hadn't expected to find her here alive and relatively unharmed, standing calmly on her own porch as if waiting for guests. "Hello, brother," Hannah said, her voice carrying clearly in the still afternoon air. Xavier went rigid in his saddle, his face draining of color. The two men with him, neither of whom Hannah recognized, exchanged confused glances. "What did you call me?" Xavier's voice was barely audible, strained with suppressed emotion. Hannah reached into her pocket and withdrew the photograph, holding it up so he could see it. "I found Mama's box," she said simply. "I know everything." For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the creak of saddle leather as the horses shifted beneath their riders. Then, with a sudden motion that made his companions reach for their guns, Xavier swung down from his mount. "Stand down," he snapped at the men. "Wait here." He approached the porch slowly, his eyes never leaving the photograph in Hannah's hand. When he reached the bottom step, he stopped, looking up at her with an expression of such naked vulnerability that Hannah felt her resolve waver. This was the man who had dragged her behind his horse, who had watched her suffer without mercy. But he was also the abandoned child in the photograph, the son Elizabeth Sullivan had given up and then found again too late. "How long have you known?" Xavier asked, his voice rough with emotion. "About an hour," Hannah admitted. "We found Mama's box hidden under the watering trough. The journal, the letters, everything." Xavier's eyes narrowed, scanning the house behind her. "Morgan's with you, isn't he?" "He was," Hannah said, choosing her words carefully. "He's gone now. Took the evidence with him somewhere. Pierce won't find it." Xavier's jaw tightened. "You shouldn't have come back here. Pierce has men watching all the roads. He knows you escaped, knows Morgan helped you. There's a price on both your heads." "I had to know the truth," Hannah said. "About Mama. About you. And now you do." Xavier's laugh was bitter, empty of humor. "Does it change anything? Does knowing I'm your bastard half-brother make you hate me less for what I did to you?" Hannah considered the question seriously. Did it change things? The rope burns on her wrists were still healing, the memory of being dragged across the desert still fresh in her mind. "Shall help me understand," she said finally, "why you were so conflicted. Why you looked at me the way you did. You saw her in me." Xavier's eyes dropped to the photograph still clutched in Hannah's hand. "You have her eyes," he admitted, "her stubbornness too. When Pierce told me to bring you in by any means necessary, I told myself it was just a job, that you were nothing to me. But every time I looked at your face, I saw hers. Is that why you didn't kill me? Why you dragged me instead?" A muscle worked in Xavier's jaw. "Pierce wanted you alive. Said dead brides don't sign marriage certificates." "But you could have been gentler," Hannah pressed. "You chose to make me suffer." "Yes," Xavier met her eyes unflinchingly. "Because I was angry. Because she chose you and that drunk father of yours over me. Because she kept you and threw me away like I was nothing. Because even when she found me again, tried to make amends, she still put her precious investigation ahead of my safety, ahead of my life." The raw pain in his voice made Hannah's heart ache despite herself. She saw in him the abandoned child, the angry young man, the son who had found his mother only to lose her again too soon. "She loved you," Hannah said softly. "Her journal is full of her regret, her longing for you. She didn't abandon you by choice. Her father, our grandfather, forced her to give you up." "She could have fought harder," Xavier insisted, but there was less conviction in his voice now. "She could have run away, found a way to keep me. She was 19 years old, alone and afraid. And later, when she found you again, she tried to make it right. She tried to build a relationship with you, to include you in her life." "By recruiting me to spy on Pierce," Xavier said bitterly. "By putting me in danger. By trusting you," Hannah corrected. "By believing in your courage, your integrity. She saw in you the same fire she saw in me. the unwillingness to accept a world ruled by men like Pierce. Xavier was silent for a long moment, absorbing her words. Behind him, his companions shifted restlessly, clearly uncomfortable with the extended conversation. "Xavier," one of them called. "We need to go. Pierce is expecting us back with the girl." Xavier didn't turn around, his eyes still locked on Hannah's face. "What are you planning?" he asked quietly. "You and Morgan. You didn't come back here just to find that box." Hannah studied her half-brother's face, weighing how much to reveal. Despite everything, despite the rope burns and the desert dragging, she felt a strange connection to this man who shared her blood, her mother's eyes. "We're going to finish what Mama started," she said simply. "We're going to bring Pierce to justice, expose his crimes to the entire territory." "He'll kill you," Xavier said, but there was no threat in his tone, only a flat statement of fact. "He'll try," Hannah agreed, "but Mama died trying to stop him. I won't dishonor her memory by doing any less." Something shifted in Xavier's expression, a softening around the eyes, a subtle change that transformed his entire face. For the first time, Hannah could see their mother in him, see the family resemblance that went beyond physical features to something deeper, more essential. "Sunday," he said, "at the church. That's when you're planning to make your move." It wasn't a question, but Hannah nodded anyway. "Will you stop us?" Xavier's gaze dropped to the photograph again, to the image of the mother who had both given him life and shaped its course in ways neither of them could have foreseen. "Pierce killed her," he said, his voice so low Hannah had to strain to hear it. "I suspected, but I didn't want to believe it. Didn't want to admit I'd been working for the man who murdered my mother." "Help us," Hannah urged, taking a step down toward him. "Help us bring him to justice, for her sake." Xavier looked back at his companions, then up at Hannah and Aisha again. A decision was forming behind his eyes, but what it was she couldn't tell. "Meet me tomorrow night," he said suddenly, "at the old mission ruins north of town. Midnight. Come alone." "Why?" "Because I have information you need. About Pierce, about his plans for Sunday. Things even your precious Marshall doesn't know." Hannah hesitated. It could be a trap. Xavier could be playing her, using their newfound connection to lure her into Pierce's hands. But the look in his eyes, there was something there. Something that reminded her of their mother's final journal entry. A determination to do what was right, no matter the cost. "I'll be there," she decided, "but I won't come alone. Falcon comes with me, or not at all." Xavier's lips twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Stubborn, just like her." He nodded once sharply. "Fine, bring Morgan if you must, but no one else." He turned and walked back to his horse, mounting in one fluid motion. To his companions, he said, "She's not here. Place is deserted. We'll try the Gonzalez farm next." The men looked confused, but they didn't argue. As they prepared to ride out, Xavier looked back at Hannah one last time, his expression unreadable. "Tomorrow night," he reminded her. "Midnight." And then he wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his companions following close behind. Hannah watched until they disappeared over the rise, the dust from their horses' hooves hanging in the air like a promise or a warning. Falcon materialized beside her, seemingly from nowhere, his rifle cradled in his arms, and his expression thunderous. "That," he said flatly, "was the stupidest, most reckless thing I've ever seen anyone do. And I've seen men challenge Apache warriors to knife fights." Hannah couldn't help the smile that spread across her face. "But it worked? Maybe. Or maybe he's setting a trap, leading us straight to Pierce." "He's not," Hannah said with a certainty she couldn't entirely explain. "He loved her too, in his way." Falcon sighed, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "You Sullivan women will be the death of me. Literally, most likely." Hannah tucked the photograph back into her pocket, patting it gently. "Let's go," she said. "We need to find somewhere safe to spend the night. And then tomorrow. Tomorrow we meet your homicidal half-brother at a remote ruin where no one will hear us scream." Falcon finished dryly. "Wonderful plan. Your mother would be so proud to—" But despite his sarcasm, there was a warmth in his eyes that told Hannah he understood. That for all his caution, all his pragmatism, he recognized the importance of this unexpected connection. This chance to gain an ally in the heart of Pierce's operation. As they saddled their horses and prepared to leave the Sullivan Ranch, perhaps for the last time, Hannah found herself thinking about Sunday morning, about the church in Copper Ridge where Pierce expected to claim her as his bride. It would indeed be a day of reckoning. but not the one Victor Pierce was expecting. For the first time since her rescue in the desert, Hannah felt something like hope stirring in her chest. Not just for her own survival, but for justice, for her mother's memory, for a future where men like Pierce couldn't buy and sell women like cattle, couldn't rule through fear and violence. A future worth fighting for, worth dying for if necessary, but first worth living for. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Research Sonnet 3.7.